Welcome to Wealth and Means, advice dressed up like hard work.
Episode 32, let's get into it.
This week, we're watching the price of trust get discovered in real time. Bond markets are charging more for sovereign credibility than they have in nearly 20 years. And the internet, which most of us still assume is mostly human, may have crossed a threshold that nobody officially announced. We've got 10 stories in what you didn't see in the news this week, each one a thread in the same fabric. In Wake Up Ready, we'll walk you through the week ahead, one of the most consequential earnings reports in a decade, a new Fed chairman's first full week on the job, and a geopolitical follow-through that could calm or unsettle capital markets, depending on what gets published and what stays vague. The knowledge bomb this week is a beautiful little paradox about credit, about how a bank can take your own money and use it as proof that you're trustworthy. Humor Me stays in that same territory. The greater debate this week pits two American ghosts against each other on the question the country has never fully answered. And in Let's Invent Again, we visit a scientist who spent 20 years teaching a molecule to pass a security checkpoint and accidentally changed medicine in the process.
We try to find the thread that connects the visible story to the invisible logic underneath it. This week, the thread is short, and it's the same one. Collateral, what you put up, what the system accepts, what makes the answer yes instead of no. Let's go find it.
Let's go.
Each week, we explore ideas that help you pause, reflect, and think more deeply about the opportunities all around you.
It's the perfect mix. A little information, a few stats, some real-world insights, and just enough deep talk to make you feel smarter before your second cup of coffee. A quick thank you to our sponsor, agentweekly.ai, chronicling the absurd, the ambitious, and the algorithmically challenged corners of the AI agent economy. 8 weeks ago, a conflict began in the Middle East that almost nobody expected to move the global bond market the way it did. Brent crude is now at $105 a barrel, up 44% since the fighting started. And the last time energy did something like this to the global economy, the word stagflation entered the vocabulary of a generation. The conflict, specifically the disruption to the Strait of Hormuz, has been characterized by the International Energy Agency as the largest supply disruption in the history of the global oil market. That's not rhetoric. That's a technical designation with real downstream consequences. Shipping rerouted, refinery schedules disrupted, energy price shocks radiating through every supply chain that runs on diesel. In April, U.S. consumer prices rose 3.8% year over year. Producer prices, the wholesale level, jumped 6%, the highest in 4 years. Think about what oil actually moves. It's not just gas at the pump. It's the cost to haul every box of cereal from warehouse to shelf. It's the energy bill for the factory making the cereal box. It's the heating bill for the grocery store keeping the lights on. When oil goes up 44%, everything downstream goes up a little too. And the compounding effect across millions of products in the American retail market is not small. The macro risk here isn't just inflation. It's the particular kind of inflation that's hard to fight with interest rates. Rate hikes work when demand is running too hot. They don't work as well when prices are rising because a sea lane is closed. The Dallas Fed published a scenario analysis on exactly this dynamic. The Minneapolis Fed is now asking whether the central bank can even look through a supply shock of this magnitude. The honest answer, based on this week's data, appears to be probably not for much longer. According to CNBC and Bloomberg this week, the April CPI came in above expectations for the third consecutive month, and the PPI surge, 6% in April, is the largest monthly print since 2022. That combination pushed the word stagflation back onto front pages for the first time in roughly 3 years.
The economy isn't overheating. It's being cooked from the outside. That's a different problem, and it doesn't have the same cure.
That same supply shock is doing something quietly alarming in the bond markets, and the numbers this week deserve more attention than the equity headlines are giving them. The 30-year U.S. Treasury yield broke above 5.1%, its highest level since 2007. Simultaneously, Japan's 30-year government bond hit the highest yield since its debut in 1999, and UK gilt yields reached a 28-year high, all three, same week. Treasury buyers haven't demanded a 5% yield on long-dated U.S. debt since the middle of the last decade. That changed this week when the Treasury Department actually auctioned 30-year bonds above 5% for the first time since 2007. According to Bloomberg, that's not a small number moving on a chart. That's the price the world is charging the United States to borrow long, and it's the highest in a generation. The Japan story is particularly worth pausing on. Japan spent 30 years in near zero interest rate territory. The Bank of Japan was the last major central bank still buying its own government debt aggressively, keeping yields artificially low. That era appears to be ending, and when Japan's bond yields rise, it matters globally because Japanese institutions are among the largest foreign holders of U.S. treasuries. What Japan does in its bond market eventually shows up in ours. Rising long-term rates tighten financial conditions without the Fed doing anything. Mortgage rates move with the 10-year. Corporate borrowing costs move with the long end. Private equity models break when the discount rate rises. And pension funds, which are the marginal buyer at the long end of the curve, start reevaluating equity allocations when bonds actually yield something meaningful. That's the quiet mechanism by which a bond market move becomes a stock market move.
When the price of sovereign trust rises to a 20-year high in 3 countries simultaneously, that's not a data point, that's a diagnosis.
Which is where Kevin Warsh walks in. Yesterday, Jerome Powell officially stepped down as chair of the Federal Reserve, ending an 8-year tenure that spanned a pandemic, a historic rate cycle, and a sustained public fight over central bank independence. He's replaced by Kevin Warsh, confirmed Thursday in the most partisan Senate vote for a Fed chair in the modern era. 54 to 45, nearly straight down party lines. For context, Ben Bernanke was confirmed 70 to 30, Janet Yellen 56 to 26. Here's the counterintuitive part, and it's important. Trump nominated Warsh partly because he wanted rates cut. That was the stated expectation. But the economy Warsh is inheriting, oil-driven inflation, bond yields at 20-year highs, wholesale prices up 6%, makes near-term rate cuts almost impossible. According to Yahoo Finance and CBS News reporting this week, futures markets now put the probability of a rate hike, not a cut, at 20 to 30% by year-end. The man nominated to lower rates might have to raise them. The Federal Reserve's most powerful asset isn't its balance sheet, it's credibility, the market's belief that it will do what it says. When the chair is confirmed in a straight party line vote, and when the president who nominated him was publicly critical of the previous chair for 18 months, the market has to ask, if Trump wants a cut and Warsh's data says hold, what actually happens? That scenario isn't hypothetical anymore. It could play out in the next 90 days.
The Fed's whole operation runs on the market believing it'll tell the truth. The question now is whether the market trusts the institution or the appointment.
What that means for ordinary households isn't abstract, and the New York Fed made it concrete on Monday. Total U.S. credit card balances stand at $1.25 trillion as of Q1. That number actually dipped slightly from the prior quarter, which sounds reassuring. It isn't, once you look at who's carrying what. 60% of American credit card holders have been in debt for at least one full year, up from 53% just 18 months ago. And increasingly, according to the Fed's own breakdown, lower-income households aren't carrying that balance from a vacation or a big purchase. They're carrying it from groceries, utilities, and gas. The personal savings rate fell to 4% in Q1, down from 6.2% just 2 years ago. The average APR on credit cards accruing interest is 21.5% right now. A household carrying the median balance of around $6,000 is paying roughly $108 per month in interest alone, on debt that may be funding essential spending. That's not a behavioral problem. That's a structural trap. Goldman Sachs published a note this week calling 2026 the year the K-shaped economy really bites. The aggregate data still looks stable. Unemployment is low, GDP holds, aggregate spending is positive. But the composition tells a different story. If the spending at the lower end is increasingly debt-financed and those households begin delinquency cycles, the macro story changes quickly. Auto loan delinquencies among lower-income Americans are already ticking up, according to the New York Fed.
The aggregate looks fine until it doesn't, and the thing that changes the aggregate is usually already visible one income quintile down.
That same question, whether the summary statistic is hiding something the distribution already knows, now applies at the sovereign level. Because this morning, Moody's Ratings downgraded the United States from its top credit rating of AAA to AA1. That makes it the first time in history that all 3 major credit rating agencies have the U.S. below their top score. S&P downgraded in 2011, Fitch in 2023. Moody's was the last holdout. It isn't anymore. The numbers Moody's cited are precise and not new. The U.S. fiscal deficit for the current budget year is already running at $1.05 trillion, 13% ahead of last year's pace. Federal debt could reach 134% of GDP by 2035, up from 98% today. Annual deficits are projected at roughly 7% of GDP, rising toward 9% by 2034. The agency's statement was direct. Successive U.S. administrations and Congress have failed to agree on measures to reverse the trend of large annual fiscal deficits and growing interest costs. That's the rating agency version of a doctor telling you that you already knew this. Markets have seen this pattern before. S&P's 2011 downgrade briefly rattled equities, and then the market recovered. Fitch's 2023 action moved bond yields by a few basis points and faded within weeks. Both times, investors treated the downgrade as a confirmation of what they already knew rather than a surprise. But the sequence matters in a specific way that the individual downgrades didn't. The holdout argument is gone. Institutional investors, pension funds, sovereign wealth funds, money market funds often require their holdings to carry top ratings from at least two of the three major agencies. That standard for U.S. Treasuries no longer applies. U.S. Treasuries aren't just another asset class. They're the collateral underpinning the global financial system. Repo markets use them for overnight liquidity. Pension funds use them as the risk-free benchmark against which everything else is measured. Central banks hold them as reserves. The downgrade doesn't change any of that overnight, but it begins a slow, legally consequential rethink across thousands of institutions whose bylaws, investment policies, and risk frameworks were written when all three agencies said the same thing. The timing of this morning's announcement, according to Moody's press release, is pointed. U.S. 30-year Treasury yields are already at 5.1%, a 17-year high. On the same day the last major agency confirms what the bond market has been pricing for weeks. The market ran ahead of the rating. The rating just caught up.
All three agencies now agree the U.S. is not risk-free. That's not a downgrade, that's a consensus.
The question of what accountability looks like is getting a different kind of answer across the Atlantic. Gautam Adani, who runs one of India's largest conglomerates, agreed this week to pay $18 million to settle fraud allegations with the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission. That number sounds large until you understand what the case was actually about. The SEC alleged that Adani and his nephew made false and misleading statements to investors in connection with a $750 million bond offering. The math of the settlement is stark. $6 million from Gautam Adani, $12 million from his nephew Sagar, no admission of wrongdoing, and separately, the Department of Justice is expected to drop its criminal fraud charges entirely. So, $18 million to settle civil allegations tied to a $750 million offering. According to CNBC, the ratio between alleged harm and actual penalty is its own statement about the cost of accountability for global actors navigating U.S. securities law. The real consequence of the case wasn't the fine, it was the 18 months during which international capital was cautious. Global banks were skeptical. Now that the legal overhang is lifting, Adani Group can re-engage international debt markets at scale. 41% of the group's total debt comes from global capital markets. The clearing of this case potentially accelerates the group's renewable energy expansion in India, which has significant implications for the broader U.S.-India strategic relationship.
The fine was $18 million. The reward for settling is access to $700 billion in international capital. You do the math on what that incentive structure produces over time.
That same pattern, bond markets repricing political risk before the policy even changes, is playing out in real time in the UK. British pound sterling fell 2% against the dollar this week, its worst weekly performance since late 2024. UK gilt yields hit their highest level in 28 years. And the cause wasn't an economic data release. It was a single politician securing a path to a by-election. Andy Burnham, currently the mayor of Manchester, announced he'd run for Parliament in Makerfield after the sitting MP stepped aside. The move is widely read as the opening of a challenge to Prime Minister Keir Starmer, whose Labour Party performed poorly in recent local council elections. Bloomberg reported Thursday that gilt yields slumped the moment Burnham's path to Parliament became clear. Why would one mayor's candidacy move a nation's bond market? Because investors associate Burnham with a specific fiscal platform. £40 billion in additional borrowing for housing and infrastructure, higher taxes on expensive properties in London, and a more expansionist approach to public spending generally. The UK bond market, which had a memorable crisis in 2022 when Liz Truss unveiled an unfunded budget, has developed a hair-trigger response to any signal of fiscal loosening. According to Bloomberg reporting, it doesn't wait for the policy, it prices the possibility. UK households are already under stress from high mortgage rates. A large portion of British mortgages reset on short fixed terms and reprice frequently. Another round of gilt yield increases translates quickly into higher borrowing costs across the real economy without anything changing in Westminster yet.
The bond market isn't waiting for Burnham to win anything. It's pricing what it fears he believes.
Let's change the altitude entirely and go back about 100 million years. Scientists in Thailand identified a new dinosaur species this week that is the largest ever found in Southeast Asia. It weighed approximately 27 tons, roughly equivalent to 9 adult elephants, and stretched about 90 feet from nose to tail. Its formal name is Nagatitan chiafumensis. Informally, they're calling it the last titan. The species lived during the late early Cretaceous period, somewhere between 100 and 120 million years ago, in what is now northeast Thailand. It was a sauropod, the long-necked herbivore family that includes the largest animals ever to walk Earth. The word last in its informal name refers to where it was found, one of the youngest rock formations in Thailand before the region was submerged as a shallow sea. This animal was among the final giants to walk this part of Asia before it went underwater. According to NPR and CNN, the paper identifying and naming the Nagatitan was published this week in Scientific Reports. Southeast Asia's paleontological record is thin compared to North America's or China's, partly because of geography, climate, and the jungle conditions that make excavation difficult. The Nagatitan is the 14th dinosaur species officially named in Thailand. Scientists say it significantly expands what we understand about how sauropods spread and evolved across the Asian subcontinent. And if an animal this large hadn't been cataloged until now, it suggests the fossil record in the region is substantially incomplete, which means there are likely other species, other ecological relationships, and other evolutionary pathways still buried in the Thai jungle.
A 27-ton animal nobody had cataloged was living in Southeast Asia 100 million years ago. The question isn't why it took so long to find, it's what else is still buried.
Staying in the world of biology, but moving the timeline from 100 million years ago to about 2 weeks ago. Scientists at the University of Rochester transferred a single gene from a naked mole rat into ordinary mice, and the mice ended up healthier, more cancer-resistant, and approximately 4.4% longer lived. The gene in question helps produce a molecule called high molecular weight hyaluronic acid. And naked mole rats have about 10 times more of it than mice or humans. Naked mole rats are the longest-lived rodents on Earth, routinely surviving 30 years or more in captivity. They're also remarkably resistant to cancer. Researchers have long suspected that high molecular weight hyaluronic acid plays a role in both. It appears to influence tissue inflammation and tumor suppression. This week's paper is the first documented successful transfer of a longevity-associated gene across species from one mammal to another, with measurable lifespan extension as the result. The 4.4% figure sounds modest until you put it in context. Applied to a human lifespan of 80 years, that's roughly 3.5 additional healthy years. More importantly, the mice didn't just live slightly longer, they were qualitatively healthier. Reduced inflammation in multiple tissues, better gut function, stronger cancer resistance. The longevity wasn't more years, it was better years. The study, published in Science according to Science Daily, also opens 2 therapeutic pathways that didn't previously exist. One, through slowing the breakdown of hyaluronic acid using drug compounds now in preclinical trials, and one through direct gene therapy approaches.
We've been looking for the biology of long life in our own cells for decades. Turns out we should have been asking the mole rat all along.
The last item in this week's radar concerns a theory about who's actually reading this. In 2021, a fringe Reddit thread proposed what it called the dead internet theory, that a significant and growing share of internet content was being generated by bots and AI, not humans, and that algorithmic amplification of that synthetic content was gradually displacing authentic human discourse. In 2021, it was a conspiracy theory. In 2026, it's getting harder to call it that. According to Imperva's most recent Bad Bot report, nearly 50% of all internet traffic now comes from non-human sources, including roughly 20% from sources classified as bad bots engaged in malicious activity. Cloudflare's own data puts non-human traffic at roughly one-third of all internet traffic. And closer to home, Dig, the original social bookmarking platform that Reddit co-founder Alexis Ohanian and Kevin Rose relaunched in open beta in January, shut down in March, just 2 months after reopening, citing an unprecedented bot problem as a primary cause. The kicker is, who's saying this now? Ohanian, co-founder of the platform that hosts the communities that gave the theory its name, said publicly last fall, "The dead internet theory is real." OpenAI's Sam Altman posted on X that he never took the dead internet theory that seriously, but it seems like there are really a lot of LLM-run Twitter accounts now. This week, an academic paper published in Computer Magazine created a formal taxonomy distinguishing between the evidence-based version of the theory and conspiracy-adjacent interpretations, essentially legitimizing the core claims. The advertising market still prices human attention. Brands pay rates based on the assumption that a human eyeball is on the other end of the ad. If a growing share of that traffic is synthetic, the underlying economic model of the internet is built partly on a fiction.
When the people who built the internet are using the phrase dead internet without quotation marks, it's time to update your prior on what you think you're reading.
3 patterns jumped out at me across those 10 stories this week. First, the systems we've built to allocate trust are repricing. Bond markets are charging more for sovereign credibility. Credit scores are struggling to distinguish good borrowers from desperate ones. The internet's authenticity systems can no longer reliably tell humans from bots. These aren't separate malfunctions. They're the same malfunction in different substrates. Second, the gap between what's visible in aggregate data and what's happening at the edges keeps widening. Unemployment is stable. GDP holds. Credit card balances tick down in Q1. But 60% of cardholders have been in debt for a year or more, and the people carrying that debt are using it for groceries, not vacations. The summary statistic says one thing, the distribution says something else. Third, accountability is becoming negotiable at scale. An $18 million settlement for a $750 million bond offering. A bond market that will price the possibility of a left-leaning leader before that leader has won a single vote. The feedback loops between power, information, and capital are getting faster and less transparent simultaneously.
If there's a through line this week, it's this. Collateral isn't just a banking concept, it's a social contract, what you put up to earn access, what others are willing to accept, and what happens when the things backing that contract start to look shaky.
Now let's wake up ready. Let's start with the biggest single event of the week. NVIDIA reports its fiscal first quarter results after the close on Wednesday, May 20th. Consensus estimates put revenue at $78.8 billion and adjusted earnings per share at $1.77. Polymarket has the probability of a beat priced at 97%, which means a beat is already baked in. What that means? The number that matters isn't whether NVIDIA beats. It's by how much, and specifically what the guidance says about the Blackwell chip supply ramp. Watch for commentary on whether gross margins hold above 70%. If they do, and guidance implies sequential acceleration, the bull thesis stays intact. If margins compress even modestly, or if supply commentary is cautious, watch small-cap semiconductor equipment names, AMAT, KLAC, and Integra, for repricing. Those are the leverage plays on the direction of the CapEx cycle, and they're the first to reprice if the NVIDIA forward story gets complicated.
A 97% beat probability means the market's already priced the win. What it hasn't priced is the guidance.
And Thursday, May 22nd, Walmart reports before the bell. This is a different kind of signal than NVIDIA. Walmart's number this quarter isn't really about Walmart. It's a health check on the lower half of the income distribution. What to watch specifically? Same-store sales data broken down by income segment and any management commentary on food price inflation and trade-down behavior. The question is whether the lower-income consumer is still showing up at Walmart or starting to pull back even there. What's already priced, analysts expect a mild beat on the back of market share gains from higher-income households shopping down. If lower-income data shows further deterioration in spending volume, not just share of wallet, watch Dollar General and Dollar Tree for multiple compression. They're the next rung down the consumer ladder, and they'll reprice quickly if Walmart's lower-income commentary is negative.
Walmart's earnings this quarter is a proxy for the lower income consumer, and right now that consumer is the most economically exposed group in the country.
Kevin Warsh officially begins his first full week as Fed chair today. There's no scheduled FOMC meeting this week, but any first public statement or interview will be treated by bond markets as a policy signal. What to watch specifically, whether Warsh signals a preference for an explicit inflation expectation anchoring framework over Powell's more data-reactive approach. The market currently prices one cut by year-end at roughly 35% probability, down from 70% just 2 months ago. Hike odds have climbed to 20 to 30% on various contracts. If Warsh's first public communication sounds even modestly hawkish, which given this week's inflation data is entirely possible, watch the 2-year Treasury yield. That instrument is the most sensitive to near-term rate expectations, and if it pushes above 4.8%, that's the tell that the market thinks the hiking cycle isn't finished.
The new Fed chair's first public words could move the 2-year Treasury more than the last 3 CPI prints combined.
Fourth watch item, the global bond market itself. U.S. 30-year yields broke 5.1% this week. The next psychological level is 5.25%. Watch whether that threshold holds or breaks in the days ahead. The mechanism to understand is pension fund behavior. Pension funds have been underweight long-duration bonds for years because yields were too low to justify the price. At 5+%, some of that institutional money starts rotating back into bonds, which could create a natural floor for yields. But if the oil price shock continues and Warsh sounds hawkish, that floor might not hold. If the 30-year breaks 5.25%, watch for 2 things: dollar strength against emerging market currencies as capital flows to yield, and watch leveraged loan markets where floating rate debt is already under structural stress from the existing rate environment.
525 on the 30-year isn't just a number. It's the threshold where pension fund math changes and the marginal buyer starts becoming a seller.
Fifth, the Trump-Xi summit follow-through. Both leaders wrapped up in Beijing on Friday saying fantastic trade deals, but as of now, no specifics have been published. This week, watch for whether any concrete agreements land, specifically around semiconductor export controls and agricultural purchases. What's already priced, markets got a modest risk-on pop from the summit optics, but no sustained rally, which tells you investors aren't convinced the handshake produced anything durable. If semiconductor restrictions don't change, which is the most likely outcome, watch Taiwan Semiconductor for its geopolitical discount. If restrictions ease even modestly, that discount compresses quickly. If agricultural deals are announced, watch corn and soybean futures for near-term supply-side relief. My personal watch this week is simpler than all of that. It's the Lime IPO. The electric scooter company filed last week targeting a $2 billion valuation on NASDAQ. They have approximately $846 million in debt due within the next 12 months and have included a going concern warning in their filing. They need this IPO to survive, and they said so explicitly. In a week where bond yields are at 20-year highs and risk appetite is uncertain, a $2 billion IPO from a money-losing company with a going concern warning is a precision test of how much risk tolerance actually remains in this market. If it prices, the risk appetite is real. If it pulls the deal, it tells you something important about where we actually are.
And that is how you wake up ready. It's time for a knowledge bomb. Here's a strange little corner of banking that doesn't get enough attention: the credit card backed by a certificate of deposit. On the surface, it sounds almost ridiculous. You put money in the bank. The bank locks it up in a CD. Then the bank gives you a credit card secured by the very money you already gave them. So, did they lend you money, or did they lend you credibility? That's the real product. A normal secured credit card usually requires a cash deposit that acts as collateral, often influencing the size of the credit line. The issuer holds that deposit as protection if you don't pay. A CD-backed version adds an older banking wrapper. Instead of just sitting as a plain security deposit, the money is tied to a certificate of deposit, which is generally covered by FDIC insurance within applicable limits. The appeal is simple. You're using idle savings to buy time, structure, and a reporting relationship with the credit system. But the psychology is where it gets interesting. Because the bank isn't saying we believe in you, the bank is saying we believe in your collateral. That sounds harsh, but for someone with thin credit, damaged credit, or no credit history at all, it's useful. The bank's risk goes down because the CD is sitting there as a backstop. The customer gets a real card, a real payment schedule, and potentially a real record of responsible repayment. It's not charity. It's not generosity. It's finance with training wheels. And that's the first lesson. Access to credit is often not about morality. It's about evidence. The bank doesn't know your character. It knows your file. It knows your income. It knows your past payments. If that record is empty or messy, the CD becomes a substitute witness. It testifies on your behalf. But here's the trap. The collateral doesn't make the credit card harmless. You still have to pay the bill. The CD is not your monthly payment account. It's the fire extinguisher behind glass. If you swipe the card and don't pay, the bank can use the collateral to protect itself. But your credit behavior still gets reported, the relationship still deteriorates, and you can still turn a credit-building tool into a credit-damaging machine. Secured card deposits are meant to protect the issuer if you default, not to replace ordinary monthly payments. So the right mental model isn't, I have a credit card backed by my CD. The right mental model is, I have purchased a small laboratory for proving discipline. That's what this is, a controlled experiment. Can you use the card lightly? Can you pay it on time? Can you keep utilization low? Can you build a boring pattern? Because boring is what credit bureaus love. They're not looking for charisma, they're looking for repetition. And this is why CD-backed credit can be quietly powerful. It turns savings into a signal. Your money stays parked, possibly earning CD interest, while the card creates payment history. In CD-secured lending, generally, the bank holds the CD while the loan is active, and the borrower may continue earning interest on it, though those funds aren't freely available while they're pledged. The trade-off is liquidity. That money is no longer fully flexible. It's pledged. It's spoken for. The bank has a claim. And this is where people get fooled by financial products that look safe. They confuse secured with free. Secured doesn't mean free. Secured means someone has a better way to collect. A CD-backed card can be smart when the goal is disciplined credit building. It can be dangerous when the goal is extra spending power. If you treat it like a bridge, it helps. If you treat it like a bonus, it bites. The bank has engineered a beautiful little paradox. You're borrowing against your own money to prove you can be trusted with someone else's. That's not stupid. That's the credit system in miniature. Collateral gets you in the door. Behavior determines whether you stay. And the knowledge bomb is this. The bank isn't really monetizing your CD. It's monetizing your future reputation. Because in finance, trust isn't a feeling. It's a ledger with memory. And that's the knowledge bomb.
Humor me. Okay, so a father brings home exciting news for his son. Bear with me. He sits down at the kitchen table and says, I got you a credit card backed by a CD. Son says, a compact disc? No. Great, because my laptop hasn't had a disk drive since Obama. Not that kind of CD. A Celine Dion album? Father, no. Certificate of death? What? No. Congressional district? Father, bank CD. Banks have DJs now? Father, certificate of deposit. So money? Yes. My money? Yes. Locked up? Yes. So the bank takes my money, puts it in financial timeout, and then gives me a credit card. Basically, backed by the money I can't use? Father, correct. That's not a credit card. That's a debit card with a hostage crisis. It helps you build credit. By proving I can borrow against money I already had? Exactly. Finance is just confidence wearing a tie. Now you're learning. What happens if I don't pay? The bank can take the CD, the Celine Dion album, the deposit. Honestly, take the album first.
There are debates that stop your scroll, and there are debates that clear the dinner table. It's time for the greater debate. The room is quiet before anyone says a word. 2 lecterns, no moderator, no charts, no applause sign, just 2 American ghosts standing in front of one American argument that refuses to die. On the left, Senator Ted Kennedy, broad shoulders, Senate voice, the kind of man who sounds like he's already halfway through a committee markup and somehow also at a family wake. On the right, Ronald Reagan, easy smile, warm eyes, the actor's timing, the governor's suspicion, the president's confidence. He looks like he might tell a joke, but the joke will have a tax rate hidden inside it. The question tonight is simple enough to fit on a bumper sticker and complicated enough to wreck every budget spreadsheet in Washington. Should America have universal health care? Kennedy begins. My argument is not that government is magic. I served in the Senate long enough to know better. Government can be slow, vain, wasteful, and very pleased with itself. But the measure of a country is not whether its institutions are perfect. The measure is whether it uses them to protect people when the market cannot or will not. Healthcare is not like buying a television. You don't shop for a trauma surgeon while unconscious. You don't bargain with cancer. You don't ask a premature baby to wait until the family deductible resets. The American promise has always been larger than cash and carry citizenship. We decided eventually that old age should not mean destitution. We decided that a child's education should not depend entirely on a parent's wallet. We decided that clean water, safe food, and basic public health were not luxuries for the lucky. Universal health care belongs in that line. Not because it's European, not because it's sentimental, because illness is universal, and a serious nation doesn't build a healthcare system around exceptions, exclusions, and fine print. Reagan tilts his head. He doesn't look offended. He looks almost entertained. Senator, that was beautifully said. And if speeches lowered premiums, we'd be the healthiest nation on earth. The trouble with government compassion is that it never arrives alone. It brings forms, offices, rules, penalties, inspectors, and one very confident fellow from Washington who's never met your doctor but has strong opinions about what your doctor may do. You say healthcare isn't like buying a television. Fair enough. But it's also not like mailing a letter. It's personal. It's local. It depends on trust, judgment, innovation, and the freedom of patients and doctors to make decisions without turning every examination room into a branch office of the federal government. You call universal health care part of the social contract. I call it a contract where the government writes the terms, sends you the bill, and then tells you it's for your own good. And yet we already have government health care, Governor. We just pretend we don't. Medicare, Medicaid, veterans care, subsidies, tax preferences for employer plans, emergency rooms required to treat the uninsured, state programs, federal programs, public dollars everywhere. CMS estimated U.S. national health expenditures at $5.3 trillion in 2024, with Medicare and Medicaid alone representing major shares of the total. So the question isn't whether government is involved. It's whether we want government involvement that's coherent, universal, and accountable, or the maze we have now. Public money, private toll booths, hidden prices, exhausted doctors, terrified families, and administrative complexity treated as a business model. That's a clever turn, Senator, but it proves my point as much as yours. Every time Washington fixes health care, it leaves behind another layer. Medicare and Medicaid, HMOs, COBRA, HIPAA, CHIP, Part D, the Affordable Care Act, the Inflation Reduction Act. Each one comes with promises. Each one comes with acronyms. Each one is sold as the patch that'll finally make the system humane and affordable. And somehow the patient ends up with more cards in his wallet, more codes on the bill, and less idea what anything costs. That's not a system begging for one final federal solution. That's a warning label. No, it's evidence that partial reform produces partial failure. We cover seniors, but not everyone. We cover the poor, but only through 50 state variations. We cover workers unless they lose the job that gives them coverage. We protect people with one law, then force them to navigate 6 institutions to use it. You're blaming the ambulance because the bridge keeps collapsing. And you're proposing that the people who built half the bridge should build the whole highway. The audience laughs. Kennedy smiles, but barely. Reagan has landed the first clean hit. Here's the contradiction I'll acknowledge. Universal health care costs money. Serious money. Anyone who says otherwise is selling poetry as arithmetic. But America already pays. We pay in premiums. We pay in deductibles. We pay in foregone wages because employer health care is compensation that never reaches the paycheck. We pay in bankruptcy anxiety. We pay in delayed care. We pay in emergency room medicine that treats the crisis because we refuse to finance the prevention. And then we pay again through taxes. The issue isn't whether we pay. The issue is whether our spending buys health. Kennedy's voice hardens there. He moves from moral appeal to prosecution. The United States spends far more per person on health care than peer countries, while utilization isn't proportionally higher. The evidence points again and again to prices, administrative load, and fragmentation as the core drivers. That's not freedom. That's inefficiency wearing a flag pin. No, Senator, freedom isn't a pricing formula. Freedom is the right to make your own arrangements, build your own associations, choose your doctor, choose your plan, and keep the government from turning every private difficulty into a federal entitlement. Once healthcare becomes a universal government guarantee, every personal choice becomes a public cost. What you eat, whether you smoke, whether you exercise, whether you ski, whether you ride a motorcycle, sooner or later, the same government paying the bill discovers an interest in supervising the behavior. And it won't call that control. It'll call it prevention. That's the Trojan horse argument. I know it well. But there's another Trojan horse in American healthcare. The idea that private paperwork is liberty. A denial letter isn't freedom. A network restriction isn't freedom. A family staying in a bad job because their child needs coverage isn't freedom. A doctor spending evenings coding for reimbursement instead of practicing medicine isn't freedom. You warn that government will dictate where doctors practice. But today, insurers dictate which doctors patients can see. Employers dictate which plans families can choose. Hospital systems dictate prices behind closed doors. Consolidated providers dictate terms because local competition has vanished. You fear concentrated power. Good, so do I. I just refuse to pretend concentrated power becomes harmless when it sends an invoice instead of a tax bill. Reagan's smile thins. That one lands, not as a cheer line, as a silence line. Then let me give you my contradiction. The old system wasn't perfect. Before Medicare, too many older Americans were exposed. Before modern protections, people with illness could be treated like bad risks instead of human beings. There are problems charity alone can't solve, and markets can be cruel when the buyer is desperate. But the answer to imperfect markets isn't unlimited government. It's better markets, stronger competition, transparent prices, portable insurance, targeted help for the vulnerable, and room for innovation. Because once Washington owns the promise, Washington owns the shortage. And when the money runs tight, as it always does, compassion becomes rationing with better stationery. Ration now. By price, yes, and price is painful. By delay, by denial, by geography, by employment, by literacy, by which parent filled out which form correctly, by whether the ambulance went to the in-network hospital. And you'd replace all those rationing systems with one national one. I'd replace accidental rationing with democratic accountability. There's nothing accidental about a bureaucracy protecting its budget. There's nothing democratic about a claim denial nobody can appeal in time. The room is fully awake now. This is no longer left versus right. It's two theories of failure. Kennedy believes the American healthcare system fails because it's not universal enough, not rational enough, not morally clear enough. Reagan believes it fails because every rescue expands the architecture of dependency, and every architecture of dependency eventually mistakes control for care. Kennedy turns toward Reagan, not the audience. Governor, your argument depends on the fear that if we guarantee health care, Americans will become passive. I think you underestimate them. People don't want health care so they can become dependent. They want health care so they can work, start companies, raise children, change jobs, leave abusive employers, survive illness, and stay in the game. Universal health care isn't the end of responsibility. It's the floor beneath responsibility. You can't ask people to climb if one diagnosis can cut the ladder in half. And your argument depends on the hope that government can build a floor without eventually lowering the ceiling. I don't underestimate Americans. I trust them more than I trust the planners. I trust voluntary institutions, doctors, entrepreneurs, churches, communities, states, and families. I trust messy freedom over tidy compulsion. Because the language of rights is powerful. Once something becomes a right, limits become injustices, costs become someone else's obligation, and politics becomes a bidding war over benefits no one wants to price honestly. Rights always cost something. Courts cost money, schools cost money, police and fire departments cost money. The question is whether the thing protected is central enough to citizenship that we accept the obligation. And if health isn't central, what is? Reagan pauses. For the first time, he doesn't answer immediately. Health is central, but government isn't the same thing as care. And markets aren't the same thing as choice. There it is, the whole debate in 2 lines. The Kennedy case is that universal health care is the missing plank in the American social contract, morally necessary, economically cleaner than fragmentation, and more honest than pretending a half-public system is private. The Reagan case is that universal health care is the most seductive kind of promise, compassionate at the entrance, coercive at scale, and nearly impossible to restrain once every private decision becomes a public liability. Neither man gets the last word, because America has never given anyone the last word on health care. It has only built another layer, passed another fix, renamed another program, and asked the same question in a more expensive decade. The debate ends where it began, not with whether Americans deserve care. Both sides say yes. The fight is over who can be trusted with the machinery. A market that can abandon you when you're weak. Or a government that can command you once it says it's helping. And somewhere between those fears sits the patient, holding the bill, waiting for the country to decide whether health care is a product, a promise, or the price of belonging. And that is the greater debate.
Let's invent again. The problem is older than virology. It's really a problem of identity. When something enters your body that doesn't belong there, your immune system attacks it. That's the whole job. The immune system is a security checkpoint, and it's very good at its work. Sometimes too good. For decades, researchers understood that mRNA, messenger RNA, the molecule that tells your cells which proteins to build, could theoretically be used as medicine. You could, in principle, deliver a genetic instruction into a patient's body and program their cells to produce whatever you needed: a cancer-fighting protein, a viral antigen, a missing enzyme. The concept was clean. The problem was delivery. The moment you introduced synthetic mRNA into the body, the immune system recognized it as foreign and destroyed it before it could do anything. The messenger was being executed before it could deliver the message. The person. Drew Weissman grew up in Lexington, Massachusetts, earned his doctorate in immunology and his MD from Boston University, completed residency at Beth Israel Hospital in Boston, and arrived at the University of Pennsylvania in 1997. He is, by almost any description, a quiet scientist, not a celebrity, not a circuit speaker, just someone who looked at a problem everyone else had walked away from and decided to stay. For most of the 2000s, his work on mRNA was largely unfunded and widely considered a dead end. Grant committees passed, industry partners looked elsewhere. The scientific consensus was that mRNA-based medicine was an interesting idea in the same way that cold fusion is an interesting idea. Theoretically coherent, practically impossible. The invention. In collaboration with biochemist Catalin Carrico, Weissman identified the specific reason the immune system kept rejecting synthetic mRNA. One of mRNA's 4 molecular building blocks, a nucleoside called uridine, was triggering the immune alarm. In the early 2000s, Weissman and Carrico discovered that by substituting a modified version called pseudouridine in place of uridine, they could produce mRNA that slipped through the body's security checkpoint undetected. Not destroyed, not rejected, simply processed. The immune system, trained to recognize the pattern it knew, didn't flag the modified molecule as a threat. The message got through. Their lab then pioneered the use of lipid nanoparticles, essentially tiny fat bubbles, to deliver the modified mRNA directly into cells where it could do its work. The whole system, modified molecule, lipid nanoparticle delivery, cellular instruction. It took about 15 years to fully assemble. The unexpected consequence. When a novel coronavirus appeared in late 2019, the platform Weissman and Carrico had spent 15 years building was the only thing in the world that was ready. Within 11 months of identifying the virus, the first mRNA vaccine was authorized for emergency use. Several billion doses would be administered in the years that followed. Weissman and Carrico received the 2023 Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine for work that most of the scientific establishment had dismissed for the better part of a decade. But the unexpected consequence isn't really the Nobel Prize. The unexpected consequence is the platform itself. The lipid nanoparticle delivery system Weissman's lab developed is now being used to explore treatment for HIV, cancer, rare genetic disorders, and respiratory viruses. The problem they solved, how to get a message past the body's security checkpoint, turned out not to be a problem specific to COVID. It was a problem specific to all of medicine. When you give a molecule the right collateral, it turns out the body will trust it. And once you figure out how to do that, there's almost no limit to the messages you can send. That's it for another episode of Wealth and Means. Advice dressed up like hard work.
We hope you enjoyed the arc. From naked mole rats lending their longevity to a mouse, to a bond market charging 20-year high rates for sovereign trust, from a CD-backed credit card that turns your own money into your best character reference, to a scientist who spent 15 years teaching a molecule to pass a security checkpoint and accidentally built the platform behind mRNA vaccines. The pattern was simple. Trust is infrastructure. Because first principles are rarely flashy.
Subscribe, rate, and share this episode. It helps more than you think.
We do this for you, to help you have a better week, a sharper mind, and maybe even a longer attention span.
And a special thanks to our sponsor, agentweekly.ai.
Until next time, stay curious.
Stay kind.
And keep compounding.